Well, I'm here with Dr. Paul Williamson, who lectures in Old Testament at Moore Theological College. And Paul was one of my lecturers. We did Ezekiel together, we did Job together. Paul was also the one who taught us how to pronounce some stuff in Hebrew at the very beginning of first year. And it's really a wonderful privilege to be able to chat with Paul about Numbers as we think about this series we're doing in Term 3 on the book of Numbers, both preaching it and teaching it in our Bible study groups. And so, Paul, I wanted to start with kind of just asking about your general thoughts on Numbers, the Numbers in the context of the Pentateuch, and just, what things are things that you would highlight as you kind of think through the book.
Okay. Numbers is a very important book in the Pentateuch, in that it's the book where the 40 years in the wilderness is explained. Why did Israel take so long to do an 11-day journey from Sinai to the Promised Land? And Numbers gives us the answer to that question. The context of all of Exodus right through to Deuteronomy is the partial fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. And Exodus records the fulfillment really of the promise of numerous descendants. So Exodus starts with Abram's descendants have now become so numerous that they pose a threat to the Egyptians. And it moves on from that to tell the story of their enslavement and their deliverance from Egypt. Numbers basically picks up the story of Israel's journey from Sinai through to Canaan. And it really picks up a story where the book of Exodus ends. The tabernacle has been erected and the people of God have been at Sinai for just over a year. Numbers covers the time between Israel's departure from Sinai and the next generation's arrival at the plains of Moab. That's the second generation's arrival. That journey should have taken less than a fortnight, but due to Israel's refusal to trust in God, it ended up taking 40 years. In some significant ways, Numbers does read like a bit of a rerun of the first stage of Israel's journey from the promised to the Promised Land. Back in Exodus chapter 14 to 17, we read about similar episodes of Israel's disbelief and grumbling. And these stories are so similar that skeptics tend to conclude that Numbers is simply depicting the same events over again. However, that misses the point entirely, which is that Israel was a very slow learner. Despite everything they had seen back in Egypt and God's actions there, they were prone to doubt and unbelief. And despite everything that they had witnessed at Sinai, they remain unchanged. They're still prone to doubt and unbelief. But thankfully the same was true of their merciful and forgiving God, whose plan for Israel remains intact.
It's really helpful. Even as you're saying these things, the first thing I'm thinking is, even though we're not quite at application yet, I'm thinking that sounds a lot like us now. It's a very universal theme that's kind of being rerun over and over again to really drive the point home. And I guess it is helpful because there are a lot of commentaries out there that'll say things like, Exodus, Numbers, basically the same thing. And so just helpful to be able to see that nothing's written there as just a copy of, but actually all of those things have unique and helpful things to teach us about God and His character and promises.
I think all of us can see ourselves in Israel. And as Christians, we can see God's grace and mercy and patience. For us as well as for Israel.
Now, especially in the context of Bible study leaders, growth group leaders, and trying to think about how to engage the text and things like that, it seems like Numbers has more than one genre going for it at once in terms of just how things are written out. What's going on there? How might we look at this? How would we approach something with multiple genres?
I don't know about the multiple genres. I would just think of two. There's narrative, story, and there's law, there's legal material. And the way these two are combined within the book has led, again, some scholars to consider Numbers just simply a hodgepodge of diverse materials, lacking any overall coherence. But actually the legal material isn't randomly stuck in at all. Rather, the legal sections are clearly connected to the surrounding narrative sections. Either they're anticipating the next narrative section or they're flowing out from the narrative section that has immediately preceded. For example, the legislation regarding the arrangement of the Israelite camp around the tabernacle that we have at the start of the book, and the role of the priests and the Levites with respect to the tabernacle and its furnishings, all that material serves to highlight the graded holiness of the camp of Israel and thus preserve God's holy presence within it without endangering those that were encamped around a holy God. And that's so important for Israel's survival. If they're going to survive this journey from Sinai, where God's presence is manifest, right through to the Promised Land, then it's very important to have a holy God in their midst. They need to live and work within certain boundaries.
Yeah. Well, it's, again, really helpful to see, because I think that was, as I was reading it, that's one of the things that it kind of is striking, that it jumps from narrative to then a bunch of law and a bunch of what the Levitical priests need to do and all that kind of stuff. But in one sense, it's just helpful to see that those things actually go together and give you the very specific detail, because it is so significant, and it does force you to slow down and think about how those things all fit together. I guess in a similar way, there are a bunch of things that are mentioned in Numbers. So Numbers kind of is top and tailed by two big census. Things like the census, tabernacle instructions, ceremonial laws, all that kind of stuff, as it kind of comes in and is referenced, even the Passover being referenced. It can sometimes feel a bit tedious to read, and you kind of already have touched on this, but how do we, I guess, as growth group leaders, Bible study leaders, how do we help people in our groups to kind of read these things and make sense of them, and kind of help to appreciate the bigger movements? Are there tips or tricks that you have in mind that could be helpful there?
Well, the material that you've mentioned, some of it does seem to be superfluous to modern readers, and in some sense it probably is, in that we're not under the law and we don't have to do sacrifice and so on. So that kind of material seems to be largely irrelevant to us, because it's not something we have to live out or put into practice. That doesn't mean that it's irrelevant for theology. It just means that it's not a practical significance for us, but it is of theological significance for us. But as I say, a lot of that material does seem to modern readers to be quite superfluous. It's almost like an unfortunate digression from the main plot. And we want to, as readers, we want to get on with the main plot. We don't want to get sidetracked by all this stuff that just seems to be, very nice, but not for us. However, these detailed instructions were of key importance for both the participants in the story itself and for the theological message of the text, and therefore they're not irrelevant. They're not a digression. They're part of the story, a very important part of the story, and a very important part to understand the overarching theological message of the book. As I've said, they're not just thrown in topsy-turvy or in any old place, but they're especially relevant to their surrounding context. Now, admittedly, it's not always obvious why some things are introduced where they are. So I have to be honest about that. Sometimes you have to work it out. Sometimes you read it and you think, okay, it might be this or it might be that. But usually, if we look at it carefully enough, a clear rationale for their location is discernible. And for a very helpful and very honest guide to such, I would recommend this book. Martin Berkula's very insightful little commentary on Numbers in the Reading the Bible Today series, where he spends a lot of time doing just this, trying to work out why you have legislation stuck in where it is and how it relates to either the preceding material, the preceding narrative, or the narrative that follows. And again, at times he acknowledges that it's his best guess, but most of the time it seems to be very insightful and very helpful, and it seems to be the right way to read the book. No, that's really helpful, and that kind of leads us on a little bit to as we think about that and think about some of the things that feel really random. The other thing about Numbers that maybe is daunting, especially in a church series over a term, is that it's a big book, and we are endeavoring to try and cover the whole book in a term in 10, 11 weeks of teaching. And so when you are doing a Bible study that covers, chapters 6 to 11, or, a big chunk like that, what are some helpful ways to approach large chunks of narrative and law? I feel a bit of an imposter in answering this question, because I tend to preach, even in the Old Testament, I tend to preach on shorter passages rather than a big block. So when you say 4 or 5 chapters, I think, wow, that's hard. That's a challenge. It's not an insurmountable challenge, but
it's a challenge.
For me, that's a challenge. But however short or however long a text, the primary goal is surely to discern and to be able to articulate its main or its overarching point. So accordingly, ideally, the various blocks of text that have been selected for study do form some kind of coherent unit with a unified focus or a unified emphasis. So that's the ideal. Mightn't always work out in practice, but that's probably the ideal. If the block of text does reflect more diversity within it, it's probably best to concentrate on a significant part within it, or on the issues or the emphases that get little or maybe no attention elsewhere in the book, rather than otherwise your studies are going to repeat themselves unnecessarily. But the main thing to do is to avoid manufacturing such coherence where none exists. Otherwise the text will get twisted to say something other than the divine author intended. So however small or large the text, try to see what holds it together, but don't force it, because if you force a passage to fit in with, it's a passage, the last chapter to fit in with the previous 4, you can force it to say something it's not intended to say.
No, that's again, that's really helpful, and I think maybe especially helpful because a few times, I mean, as I've been reading it recently to try and prep for this, a few times I've found that as I'm reading it, there seems to be things that when you first read it quickly through, it feels like a contradiction, but it's actually just showing the various layers to, in one sense, they trust in God and that's how they make the journey, but then Moses is really keen that his father-in-law stays with them, but it's still God who does all the work, but also he's put a bunch of people around them to help them, and you kind of, it makes it seem like maybe it's not just God, but it kind of is just God, and then I think that's helpful to just keep thinking, because if it's too clean, then it also doesn't match maybe with what it feels like in real life.
And that one you just mentioned, really, like as I was reading Numbers myself recently, as I read it, I thought, that's strange. God's the tabernacle and so on, it's been all emphasized since the very start of the book, that God's going to be leading him, and directing him and so on. And then you have Moses asking Jethro's son to help and to guide them. Is that doubt in God's guidance or what? But I was reading Martin's commentary on this, and he suggests, and I think it's quite insightful, that what Moses is maybe asking Jethro to do is guide them as to the best places to find water, best places, because he was a shepherd from the area, and there would have sort of insider information. So it's not that Jethro is sort of Hobab's directing them and guiding them to where they're going to go next. God's doing that, but if you like, when they get to the location, Hobab is directing them maybe to the best place to set up camp and that type of thing, which removes any contradiction.
That's right.
Any suggestion that Moses isn't fully trusting God.
That's right. Which I guess is then doubled up by the fact that God himself says there's no one as humble and no one who's as faithful in all the land as Moses is. So and I guess the other thing is just in terms of breaking down numbers in order to understand it, could it be helpful, for example, to skim some parts and focus in on other parts in a way that kind of in its blocks or sections you get a theme that starts to be explored, and then there's kind of a little elaboration of that theme with a particular narrative, or in one of the areas to talk about sin and judgment and how much you really do need to trust in God's law, and then there's, I think it's 4 or 5 verses specifically on the person who broke the Sabbath and the very significant judgment that came on that person. So are there ways like that? Like, is that a helpful way to approach things? Or
And again, I think that's an example, if you like, of a high-handed or intentional sin, which the previous passage has been highlighting is unforgivable. So it's a very serious sin. So again, it's an example of, it's not just thrown in there.
That's right.
It serves an illustrative purpose. So what is an intentional sin in practice? Here's an example.
And again, really helpful. And I guess, I mean, we'll cover this a little bit later, but just things like that are I find them to sometimes be a bit tricky to talk through, because then a bunch of questions will come up inevitably for avid readers who are thinking about things.
Yep.
But just, it then sounds like God is really, really angry, and it feels like a very strong reaction to something that maybe we don't think about in quite the same way, which hopefully will then bring up discussion and help us to start to explore a bunch of themes like God's judgment, righteous anger, wrath, purity, him turning away from sin, all this kind of thing.
And I suppose again with that one you've just mentioned, like for us today, who most Christians today, certainly here in Australia, aren't into Sabbath keeping, and therefore it's not something that is, would be considered, breaking the Sabbath wouldn't be considered something that would warrant death. It's not a serious thing. It's not even a relevant thing maybe, but for ancient Israel it was huge. It was the sign of the covenant. So like that's how it's presented in the book of Exodus. So for this Sabbath breaker not only to intentionally sin, but actually to break the very sign of the covenant with God, makes it really, really serious. So what mightn't be serious for us today was certainly a lot more serious for God's people in that time and circumstance and situation under the law.
No, that's helpful. I mean, it was one of your colleagues, George Athos, I still remember in second year, he said, your second best friend is context, and obviously your best friend is Jesus. And so if your second best friend is context, then this stuff is actually really helpful, because it gives you an idea of why there's such a strong reaction, but also starts to explore those wider themes. And that's kind of what I think is a helpful way to move into now, just thinking a little bit about themes. There are themes and theology that are worth digging into, that we see play out in Numbers and illustrated in Numbers, and kind of that's a place that then it kind of continues through the Bible, talking about some of those themes. What are helpful ways to explore these things without straying from the text? Helpful ways to think about digging into a particular theme. Maybe if there's an example of a theme you'd like to throw around. And
well, I suppose I'd want to discuss all those things within the context of the book and within the particular sections of the book, and therefore it's important to think about the sections, and people will break up the book in different ways. Like some suggest that you've got two main parts, where the first part deals with the Exodus generation and their failure to enter the land with the 40-year wilderness period as a consequence, and then the next generation who succeed, if you like, and so on. Others sort of look at it geographically in terms of where Israel's placed. So they're at Sinai, then they move from Sinai to Kadesh. That's where the rebellion occurs, and the result of that is they're kept out of the promised land. Then there's it's interesting in Numbers that the 40 years of wilderness wanderings gets very little attention. It's very significant, but there's not a lot of information about what happened when they were wandering around in the desert as a punishment. In any case, when the story sort of picks up again, they're moving then from they're moving back really to where they started just before the rebellion, and so they move from Kadesh again then to Moab, but I think it's important that whatever themes you want to find, you look at it within that overarching context to see how it fits into the book as a whole, how it fits into that part of the book in particular. But the recurring themes in the book, such as God's presence, or Israel's grumbling, or the judgment that was the consequence of that, or atonement, or forgiveness, or the inheritance. Again, those are all key themes in Numbers, and when I say the key themes, they're themes that are emphasized over and over and over again, so they're pretty important. I'd be inclined to discuss such matters where or whenever they arise in the text itself, and yet it would be helpful to underline the significance of such repeated emphases and reflect on how the book as a whole stresses the significance of these things, that despite despite Israel's many shortcomings, God's grace, God's plans prevail. Because if you like, Numbers, like parts of Exodus, it's a catalogue of Israel's transgressions, but it's more than that. It's showing how God's grace and mercy prevails over Israel's transgressions. So mercy, if you like, triumphs over judgment. That seems to be a key message, a key aspect which is illustrated throughout Numbers. So there was and there is hope beyond judgment, and this is even more the case for the people of God today, obviously, for Jesus has borne the punishment for all our transgressions, and he has secured for us an eternal inheritance. So, looking at these themes in Numbers and then taking them and seeing how these themes in Numbers apply and are relevant to us today, and obviously they become very relevant for us through Jesus, because Jesus has succeeded where Israel fails, and Jesus has won for us a much better, an eternal inheritance, not just a piece of real estate in the Middle East.
Yeah. That's again, It's really interesting to think about things and think about them in the bigger picture. So yes, in the context of the book of Numbers, but also just in the overarching themes of Scripture. Because it really does help us to start to see some of the things that make it much clearer when it comes to Jesus. I remember a mentor of mine saying that he used to do this whenever he did any workshops with people who maybe felt like the Old Testament was not as relevant to us anymore. And he would say to them, he's like, "Okay, I want you to explain the significance of Jesus, his life, death, resurrection, but you can't use anything that pops up in the Old Testament first." Right. And people just tried and couldn't. Any of the words that you would classically use to describe Jesus, they first come in the Old Testament, and it kind of gives you all the background you need in order to really understand and appreciate the significance. And I guess Numbers is...
And again, that highlights what we were talking about earlier, because there's so much emphasis in atonement, sacrifice and so on, that sacrificial system. And it's understanding the importance of it in the Old Testament that highlights what Jesus has done for us. How Jesus has surpassed that and what he's done for us.
And then as we kind of think about themes and things like that, it's also, I think, helpful to learn from this in context. So in terms of implications and application, there's things that we can see in light of the New Testament, but also are there things particularly that we can see within the Old Testament original context before jumping to the New Testament that are helpful for us to explore, just so that we're not too quickly jumping when there are things there that we really want to wrestle with.
Okay. Well, it's important to think theologically about the implications or the application of any Old Testament text. In other words, what does this text, what does this passage, what does this book teach us about God, teach us about God's purposes? And Numbers has an awful lot to say about God's presence and God's holiness, as well as God's grace and God's patience. God's presence and holiness is emphasized by the specific and the reiterated arrangements of the Israelite camp around the tabernacle, and the necessity of so much sacrificial and cleansing ritual to ensure that Israel can survive in close proximity to a holy God. God's grace and patience is especially seen in how, despite Israel's catalogue of grumbling and rebellion, his promise to bring them into the promised land remains intact. And all of this is a mere shadow of the New Testament reality that God's people enjoy in Christ. Accordingly, as we work through any section or any passage in Numbers, two key questions I think have to be asked. What does this material tell us about God and Israel's covenant relationship with God? So that would be the first question. I think I'd ask that of any book in the Old Testament. That would be the first question. And the second question, how is this reality that we see in this Old Testament book fulfilled or surpassed in Christ and the new covenant relationship that we have with God through him? And again, like take grumbling. Israel grumbled. We grumble. Israel's grumbling was serious and had serious consequences. Our grumbling is serious and has serious consequences. But the difference for us is that Jesus paid the price. But on saying that, there are other aspects in Numbers that would suggest that, certainly the New Testament seems to emphasize this, that we can, or people today can, fall into the same mistakes as Israel and suffer eternal consequences. So in one breath we can say Jesus has forgiven us and therefore we don't need to fear what Israel experienced in terms of judgment. but the New Testament also has lots and lots of warnings, and interestingly, most of the books that have these strong warnings use numbers
The reference back to
to
numbers.
make the point.
Yep.
Be careful that you don't do what the Israelites did. Look what happened to them.
Yeah.
And Hebrews in particular,
Yeah.
the consequences of following Israel's mistakes are very serious.
Yeah. And it's a bit of a. It feels scary because I think we want to say, it's okay. Jesus covers everything, no problem.
Yeah.
But when we actually wrestle with what the text is saying, it's a little more layered than that.
Yeah.
And that Jesus does cover everything. His blood is sufficient, but there are things that the New Testament, as you're saying, really does push us to think about and consider as people who follow walk with Jesus.
Yeah.
This is something that came up actually as I was reading part of Numbers today,
Right.
and I just thought, I got to ask you because I'm not entirely sure. I'm thinking about, again, application in the context of the Old Testament, and I'm thinking about when it comes to the significant judgment that God brings down on the grumbling or rebellion of the people against the leaders that He has put in place.
Mm-hmm.
And so in one sense, I think the easy throwaway line answer is, if they're grumbling about Moses, they're grumbling about God, because God's the one who put Moses in that position. But there are some significant, so I just think Korah, Dathan, Abiram, they're grumbling against Moses and against Aaron, and some significant judgment that comes as a result of that. And then Miriam going leprous and having to, the whole of the community having to pause because she was put out for the 7 days. Just how do we think about these things, and especially think about these things without falling into the danger of, therefore beware of your pastors, or falling into the what might seem like easy application, but maybe is not exactly what God's trying to say in Numbers.
Yeah, well, in a sense, like repeatedly we see them grumbling against their leaders. And that's, again, something that Christians can equally fall into doing. And if Numbers teaches us anything, it teaches us that God's appointed leaders, it's a serious thing. It's a serious matter. And the New Testament teaches us not to grumble against our leaders, but to submit to our leaders. And therefore, as a Christian, we can read Israel's grumbling and read about its consequences, and it reminds us how serious this matter is, because again, sometimes today we might think, well, grumbling, it's only a little sin. But Numbers would suggest, no, it's not a little sin. And therefore we tend to sort of categorize sins into different boxes. And I think it does remind us that all sin is serious, and all sin took Jesus to the cross, and therefore we need to be careful that we don't sort of minimalize our own sin, such as grumbling or complaining about our pastors or whatever, our leaders and so on, which is very easy to do, especially if they're not, doing what we want them to be doing. It's very easy to just fall into this pattern of grumbling and complaining, and making their job difficult, whereas the New Testament exhorts us to make their job a delight, to make it easy. So rather than grumbling and complaining, again, if we've got an issue, the thing to do is to deal with that issue correctly, by going to the person and telling them and talking about it and so on, trying to get it sorted out. But just simply grumbling about it and so on, that's not a positive thing to do, and it seems the Bible suggests it's a very serious misdemeanor, if you like.
Yeah. And I guess that it comes up in chapters 16, 17, 18, that part of the problem was they were grumbling, and then when Moses comes to talk to them, they don't want to meet with him. So there is actually we're not even going to talk to you about this, we're just grumbling for the sake of it. The other thing, I guess, is before we jump to the New Testament and kind of land and finish there, it's the case that there's a bunch of Psalms, for example, that tend to reference things that are happening in Numbers, Psalm 67, 95, 105, etc. How do we use other Old Testament passages to maybe help us to get some clarity on how we might interpret what's being said? And is that a helpful thing to do, or how would we go about doing that?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think I did look at those passages you mentioned, and I think that they are making the same points, so that they're not just sort of taking a verse out of context. They're actually making the point, reiterating the point that's being made in Numbers. So, for example, when we recall whether they're recalling Israel's transgression in the wilderness, how they tested God at Meribah, that's Psalm 95, or whether they're rejoicing in their God-given victories over those who opposed them, Sihon and Og, that's Psalm 135, or whether they're echoing the Aaronic blessing, that God be gracious, bless, make his face shine upon them, and so on, Psalm 67. These psalms make it clear that the blessing or otherwise of Israel's ancestors were very real possibilities for subsequent generations also. So it's this point that we're making in relation to us. It also applied in relation to later Israelites. So later Israelites could repeat their ancestors' mistakes and bear the consequences, or they could experience their ancestors' blessing, and obviously that's the preferred option. In other words, despite the passage of time, Israel's God remains the same. His promises of blessing were still valid, and his threats of covenant curse also were still valid. And this accurately reflects the theological message of Numbers, as I've said, for in many respects this book highlights these two prospects, blessing or curse. And again, it mightn't be said explicitly in Numbers, but like Leviticus ends with these two prospects. And then we see, if you like, even as talking about the distant future, we see these two prospects acted out in the book of Numbers. And that reminds me really in Exodus, after the golden calf incident, which was, if you like, Israel's fall. It was the most serious. Like they'd done other things, but that was the big serious one in Exodus, just as the rebellion in chapter 13, 14 is the big serious one in Numbers. But in Exodus, after Israel's fall, some the ringleaders are punished at the time. But God, interestingly, says, when the time comes to punish them, I will punish them. And when is that? And maybe I'm wrong, but I suspect it's true of that generation. When the time came to punishment is the time in Numbers 13, 14, and the punishment they received at that point was that they are kept out of the promised land. Okay. So the point is that Israel's rebellion is serious, and later generations should learn from that and should avoid falling into the same trap of rebelling against God, of not trusting God's word, God's promises, and so on. So the second generation was expected to learn from the experiences of the first, and the same was true for all future generations of Israelites. The lessons of Israel's experience in the wilderness, which is the Hebrew title for Numbers, remains pertinent for all future generations of Israelites, and as I've said, remains pertinent for modern day believers as well.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of finish off, as we then move into the New Testament, and we've already talked a little bit about the fact that New Testament passages actually refer back to things that happen in Numbers, and so we have the very big Hebrews 3, 1 Corinthians 10, and then we have maybe the smaller things, but no less significant things in Jude, talking about Balaam, and then in Revelation. And I guess as we look at these things and how the New Testament applies these things, how might we use these things to help us as well with implication, application?
Yeah. Well, I suppose I've touched on some of this already, but in some New Testament texts, the material from Numbers clearly serves as a warning from Israel's history. It's a warning for Christians. Look what happened to Israel. Don't fall into the same trap. So it's a warning not to do what the wilderness generation foolishly did, which was grumbling against God or his appointed leaders, testing the Lord rather than fully trusting in his word, succumbing to the temptations of sexual immorality or idolatry. And with Paul, Hebrews also warns of the consequences of ignoring so great a salvation. And likewise, Jude uses such material to warn of eternal judgment awaiting those who pervert the grace of God into a license for immorality. Those who, like Balaam, put personal profit before spiritual fidelity. Those who, through grumbling, fault-finding, ungodly acts, defiant words, etc., have associated themselves with Korah's rebellion. Like the wilderness generation, Christian believers clearly have a responsibility to keep ourselves in God's love, knowing at the same time that it's God alone who is able to keep us from stumbling and to present us faultless before His glorious presence, etc. And that's where some of the other New Testament passages citing Numbers come into play, like the bronze serpent that dying Israelites looked to in faith for healing. Christians look to the cross on which Jesus was exalted, John 3, where that Numbers passage is clearly cited and as the background. Something akin to God's dwelling in the midst of the Israelite camp. The Word of God has become flesh and made His dwelling among His people by His Spirit, John 1. We have a leader who's greater than Moses. We've got a great high priest who far surpasses Aaron, one who through the sacrifice of himself has become the source of eternal salvation for those who obey Him. And notice the word obey. Securing what the blood of bulls and goats could never do, making perfect forever those who are being made holy. So this latter bit doesn't constitute a license for sin, and I think it's important today that Christians realise this. We've got a greater salvation, we've got a full salvation, but that doesn't mean we can sin as we please and do as we like. God still expects, in fact, if we love Him, we will obey Him. Jesus said that Himself. So it's not a license to sin. God's grace should never be used as a license to sin. Rather, it should spur us on to love and to faithfulness, knowing that even if we do fail Him like Israel failed, God will never fail us. And I think that's the overarching positive gospel message that we get from Numbers.
Yeah.